Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this reading wrap up. This is not for any set particular period of time. This is just since the last time we chatted, the books that I've been reading since then. I've been promising with all of these, that I'm gonna keep my comments shorter, and so far I have been proven to be a liar through and through. So we're going to jump right into it, and we're going to talk about the first book that I read since last time we talked, which is Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. So for this book, I did this as part of a buddy read with Jordan over from iWizard, which was a good bit of fun. I've been watching Jordan for a few years now. He's actually one of the people, in case my shameless ripoff of his name isn't clear enough, he's one of the YouTube channels that really inspired me to get on here and start talking about things and take some of my reading a little bit more seriously. So this was a lot of fun to read this with him, and I think I'm going to be reading some more books with Jordan just over the next few months here. This is obviously by Larry Correia, who's a pretty popular author in terms of modern fantasy novels. It's probably Bane's most popular author in terms of the books that they're putting out these days. He's definitely one of the big ones. And this is interesting because Correia is known for his urban fantasy stuff, the Monster Hunter books. This is different. This is an epic fantasy series. It's sort of set in a like Southern Asian inspired fantasy world in which there is this very isolated country, this very isolated nation that has a very strong caste system. So you have the elites, you have the nobles, and the people in the lowest classes are not even considered to be human, and they might even be called inhumans. And that there are these protectors, these guardians, who are sort of like a ninja fighting force. Defenders of the land, and they do a lot of keeping the peace, but they also help protect the land from demons that come out of the water. These beings are called demons. They're probably some sort of Lovecraftian adjacent type of creatures that come and invade the land. And there's this sort of cold war going on between the people and the demons, where the people say, we don't go into the water, demons don't go on the land. And if there's any interference there, it's death to the person who violates the law. So this follows a protector by the name of Ashok, and he discovers pretty early on that people have messed with his mind, that the memories that he has that are a core part of who he is and the beliefs that he holds very deeply at the core of his being are not actually natural memories. These are not actual experiences that he's had. These are not actual beliefs that he's formed based on his own life experience. These have been planted in him specifically by people who are trying to use him. And meanwhile, inside of the inner court, there's a bunch of political upheaval going on with the king. I've actually got a couple of notes here. Let me just make sure I'm getting everything here. Some of the inner political turmoil is threatening to tear the kingdom apart as there's potential conflict with the water demons approaching. Not just the Cold War, but all in all, war. So this book covers a lot of big fantasy tropes. Chosen ones, sentient swords. There's some element of hero's journey, things that you could point to here. In fact, some of them are a little bit trickier to notice because Correia plays with them in such a natural way. They don't feel forced. They don't feel like we're following. I mentioned the hero's journey, but it's not something like Aragon where it feels like we're following a checklist. It comes out so naturally that it took me till about a week after reading the story, and I was just thinking about it, to realize that in a lot of ways, this almost reads like a Moses story of a character who's, very much in the upper class, is a leader in that upper class, and then realizing that his life is not what he was told that it was. There's actually more to it, and that he's been placed in that position to serve a higher purpose. The main character must decide who he wants to be after all of these years of mind control. And really, Ashok is not the deepest character you'll ever read. He's almost a Conan type of figure in that he's a brawler. He's kind of a beefcake, if you will. But I found him to be very compelling. This does not come off as Tolkien-inspired fantasy, as just generic medieval fantasy. This pulls a lot more from, I mentioned Conan, it pulls a lot more from Robert E. Howard and the pulp tradition than it does from Tolkien. So, and I mentioned Lovecraft earlier too. So I think that for people who are like, I want more sword and sorcery, but I want kind of a modern spin on it. Maybe some things in the older books people are less comfortable with, feel like they haven't aged as well. That's fine. I think there's something here. So I believe this series is 6 books long. Currently, I plan on reading more of them. I really enjoyed Son of the Black Sword. I'm kind of leaving my thoughts a little bit more general here, but I'll tag my discussion with Jordan down below. And if you want to hear my full thoughts, we said we'd do spoilers, but we didn't. That whole conversation can be watched spoiler free. So this was a really entertaining book. I'm going to come over here to my tier list. My ad blocker stopped working. So thanks for that. I appreciate that. So we're going to be advertising for A Healthy Body Needs Gum. As we drop this here, I am probably going to put Son of the Black Sword just above the Dark Tower and below Thousandfold Thought by R. Scott Baker. Really enjoyed this book. I think it's very good. I do think it's probably, if it's not 5 stars, it's very close. So excellent book 1 to what is promising to be a very entertaining series. Speaking of entertaining series, let's talk about Calde of the Long Sun by Gene Wolfe. Now, this is very interesting because obviously I'm finishing up Book of the Long Sun as I've been rereading the Book of the New Sun with the Talking Story guys, which has been a good bit of fun. And Calde is actually a term that popped up in Book of the New Sun. I was like, oh, I forgot that was used there. There's not a whole lot that I can say about this book because it's book 3 in a quartet. Other than to say, we're following the same plot with Patera Silk being this priest figure who is, like, he's a spiritual figure, but he's being placed in a governmental situation. There's an uprising that's coming inside of the world, inside of this massive spaceship, this world-sized spaceship that everybody lives in. There's an uprising coming, and he is sort of the central figure of it. He is a figurehead, even if he doesn't want to be. And he's needing to grapple a lot with his own sense of morality and of things that are being done in his own name that he disagrees with, violent things. And even in book 1, sort of the push and pull between Patera Silk was, do I do things that I believe to be evil, violent things that I normally would object to in the name of doing the right thing? Is that a morally acceptable sacrifice to make? And that continues here. There is some very, very cool repeating of motifs and ideas from earlier on in the series in Calde of the Long Sun. In a lot of ways, this is the Uprising book. So if book 1 is like a heist meets The Exorcist, and I forgot what I classified book 2 as, this one is like Les Mis meets Book of the Long Sun, if you want to put it that way. The questions and ideas of faith and the faith questions that Wolfe deals with here are probably at their most interesting. If Book of the New Sun is about a main character sort of like stumbling his way into a world of faith that he didn't know existed, Book of the Long Sun is almost about a character who his faith is very central to him, almost stumbling out of it, coming to a state of deconversion almost, which I found really, really interesting to see how Wolfe explores that. Because obviously, as with anything in Wolfe, it's not just straightforward. It's not going to be something that's just super simple to parse apart. Also, Wolfe has lightsabers in this book. I mean, they've been in all the books, but they're prominently featured in this one, except instead of just being a generic lightsaber, like they cut through the fabric of reality. So, that's badass. Maytera Marble is one of the robot nuns that we've talked about before in the Book of the Long Sun books, and she becomes one of the most bizarre and interesting characters in this book. So I'm interested to see where things go in book 4, with her especially. This is one of the better books in the Long Sun. I say one of the, I mean, there's 4, but of the 3 I've read, I'd probably put the second not quite as good as Nightside the Long Sun, but I do think I liked it more than Lake of the Long Sun. And to be perfectly honest, I think Lake of the Long Sun was confusing, was a bit difficult for me to grapple with, and this one I felt more grounded in, felt like I had a better handle on it. So in terms of ranking it, let's pull it up here. Now, where did we put Lake of the Long Sun before? Okay, so we put Lake of the Long Sun there. And honestly, In hindsight, I think I would drop Lake of the Long Sun right below David Benioff there. Yeah, that seems probably a little bit better. Okay, and then Calde of the Long Sun, I'm actually going to drop right where I had Lake of the Long Sun before. Just in terms of how my opinion on things have changed. You want to talk about how my opinion of things have changed. This excellent tier, we could do all sorts of rearranging there. I'm sure we will once we get to some of that, oh so sweet end of the year content. But yeah, that's the Gene Wolfe of it all so far this month, and yeah, going through. I'm finishing up as of the recording of this. I am finishing up Claw the Conciliator, and just chef's kiss. It is so good. It is so good to be back with Wolfe. So let's talk about the next book that I read. And once again, this is Lord Foul's Bane by Stephen R. Donaldson. To say once again, this one I'm questioning how much to say about this, because I also did this as part of a buddy read with Jake from Nord Level Rising and Zachary Shea. So we will be having a full discussion of this come out. So I'll keep my thoughts somewhat brief, other than to say, this book has a very bizarre reputation that does not match the tone of the book at all. This is often listed as one of the early books in the grimdark genre, which is certainly not true. It has some similar DNA to what grimdark would become, but this is certainly not a grimdark book. This is very much a classic fantasy that is about a leper named Thomas Covenant who lives in the real world, and one day gets into an accident and is teleported into this fantasy land, in which he is told that he is the prophesied hero returned to save them all from the Sauron devil character, Lord Foul. So, he is Lord Foul's Bane. And this is a really odd fantasy book in a lot of ways, because what Stephen Donaldson does is he plays a lot with contrast. Donaldson has very beautiful writing, and he crafts this very beautiful fantasy world that is almost borders on saccharine, with how sickly sweet and beautiful and lush and amazing it is. And the whole time, Thomas Covenant is this twisted, nasty, bitter character who does nothing but think about himself and grumble and cares nothing for the people that are around him. And he is called Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever, which is what the series is called. He's called the Unbeliever because the entire time, down to the last, through the entire adventure, thinks that all of it is his own insanity. None of this is real. This is all just happening in his mind. And Donaldson plays with that. He does a lot with that. So people compare this to Tolkien. It is similar to Tolkien only in that both of them are drawing from similar wells in terms of classic fantasy and really beautiful writing. They are not similar in terms of tone or what the story is doing. What Tolkien does in terms of spiritual depth, Stephen Donaldson really plays a lot with psychological depth. And there's some Jungian stuff going on here. Now, I'm not an expert in Jung by any extent, so I would definitely defer to others to kind of parse out some of that more. But yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this book, other than to say I don't think this book will work for a lot of modern readers, and I'm not surprised that it is polarizing at all for a plethora of reasons. One of them being you think Lord of the Rings has a lot of walking. Goodness sake. Lord Foul's Bane has a lot of walking. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing at all. I'm just saying that won't work for a lot of modern readers. And yet, I think that there is a lot more depth and interesting things to think about and things to chew on and things that you can get out of this than there are in almost any other grimdark novel that I've read. Like I said, it shares enough DNA that'll make that comparison there. Certainly more deep than anything Joe Abercrombie's written that I've read. So for Lord Foul's Bane, let me pull this up here. Where are we going to put this? There's a couple of different spots. Honestly, this whole tier list this whole tier list was a mistake. We should burn it to the ground and start over again. I think I would drop this In Between by Blood by Salt and The Sunset Limited, which is odd because my recollection is, and I'll even check this as I'm saying this here, my recollection is that I ranked this only 4 stars on Goodreads, and that's because it's not a perfect novel. There's issues with it, but I found it to be a very exciting novel in a lot of ways in terms of the stuff that Donaldson is doing. I think he does things that are unique here. Yeah, I only gave this 4 stars, and it's like, what? But you gave Sunset Limited, and I think probably even The Rising 5 stars. It's like some of these books you gave 5 stars to, and the rankings in my mind are very arbitrary. It's just a vibe check, but yeah, I'm excited to talk more about. Sorry, this is probably rambly here, but I'm excited to talk more about Lord Fowl's Bane with those 2 other guys. I think that's going to be a great time, and I'll be sure to post about it here when the time comes. My next read, and here's where we're getting into the indie fantasy portion of the month, and that is because my indie fantasy read was Cold Silver for Souls by Tori Tekken. So I'll state at the outfront here, as I did with the Bloodstones, I don't know Tori personally. I've interacted with her a little bit, but some people who review this book on BookTube are close friends with her. I'm not. I know who she is, and I've watched her stuff, and I've read one other of her books. And she was kind enough to send me a review copy of this, but we're not close friends in terms of that. Not opposed to it. I'm just putting out there as far as what my relationship is to her as a booktuber. That's it. She was very kind in sending me a review e-arc of this. Cold Silver for Souls is a fantasy western. Now, as a subgenre of fantasy, there's been a little bit of this. So there's the Dark Tower, but the Dark Tower series is maybe 20% western. There's a couple of books that lean into it, but a lot of the books are doing their own thing. There is the Wax and Wayne books by Sanderson, which could very laughably be called a western. So honestly, probably the closest is Red Country by Joe Abercrombie, which is basically just a bunch of western tropes put into a fantasy story. But it's not really a western novel. And as it turns out, I read this in the month of June, which, as we all know on BookTube, is June on the Range, in which you read Western novels. So it happened to be quite providential, shall we say. This is a story of a bounty hunter, pictured here on the cover, named Hunter. And she has a past that is chasing her the entire novel. She is she's not just a bounty hunter, she is also a necromancer. Which for a lot of people, they're like, whoa, that sounds so cool. And I'm not saying that it doesn't, but necromancy is something that I tend to be very picky about in terms of how it's portrayed in books. Because I think a lot of people just go with, wow, so metal, dude, and don't think through the repercussions of it. And Tekken does here, but I'm getting ahead of myself. She is hired for one of these traditional things. She's hired by the local silver mine boss to tie up some loose ends for one last job. But as it turns out, the job isn't what it seems. What she has been paid to do as a job and her own conscience begin to conflict with one another, and she needs to make some very key decisions that will impact her career, her stability, whether or not her life is in danger, and will also impact the lives of quite a few other people. The other person pictured here on the cover is her animated corpse, Rip. So she's a necromancer. This is a corpse she has brought back to life. Sort of. He's basically a zombie who follows her around. One of the things that I especially liked about this book is that the whole book is told in first-person perspective from Hunter. And we'll get to more of that later in this video and as to why I like that. But I am particularly partial to novels that are a first-person perspective done well, where we don't have a cast of 300 characters that we're following. We're in one person's head, one person's experience for an extended period of time. You look at a lot of my favorite novels or novel series, whether it's Kingkiller, Sun Eater, Book of the New Sun, what have you. Many of them are like that. And what Tekken does what's immediately clear that she's doing in just the first few pages is she has a very, very strong authorial voice that comes through the character of Hunter. Within a few pages, you know so much of how she ticks, how she processes the world, and what her worldview of things is. And you also get a lot of. Here's one of the things that is both well done and also frustrating is that Tekken tells you very little, gives you very little answers to many of the big questions that are asked here. She just plants seeds. And hopefully we get more books in the series because I'm very interested to know where things go. There is a lot that is very subtly implied about Hunter's backstory that you never learn about. It's just icing on the cake that implies a greater depth beneath it, but we never get solid answers out of it. So there's a strong first person character voice. She has a very strong personality that has a lot of sass, but also and grit, but also a lot of pain behind her. You can tell that Hunter's been through some stuff, that she's not had a particularly happy life leading up to this. I talked about her being a necromancer, and we'll talk about that too here. So she does have this power, this supernatural power over people who have died, people who are dying. And yet, Tekken really does not let Hunter just get away with it as being a cool superpower. There's a cost to pay for it, and it's a high cost. Having Rip, this person that Hunter has killed, who follows her around as sort of this zombie looming figure in the background, is almost this externalization of it's like her guilt is following her. It literally is an externalization of her past haunting her. In order to reanimate this corpse, one of the elements that Tekken plays with in this book is that Hunter needs to put a small piece of her soul uh, into Rip, into the animated corpse. And so it almost serves as like this metaphor of allowing guilt or trauma or pain or those types of things to have a small part of you, and that has repercussions over time. So there's some really interesting ways that she plays with it, not just as literal like magical thing, but also some of what it symbolizes, and some of the symbolism there I found to be very good. There's also good attention to details here. Whether it's her knowledge of horses, the cold, uh, different survival things that Hunter has to go through. There's a lot of good attention to detail here in this book. Let me give one sort of like negative with the book, and then I'll end with some very high praise. And my one negative is that the ending I found to be a bit underwhelming. Now, this is me speaking from my personal experience. This is not some objective statement about the book. I'm just saying I found it to be a bit underwhelming. I thought we were building to something, and the ending was just kind of like, oh, okay, well, like maybe in book two. So at this point, I am much more looking forward to book two of this than I am of book two in the Bloodstones, and I really liked her Legends of the Bruhai book. The Bloodstones. I really like that, but and here's where the praise comes in. I've been reading a lot of self-published fantasy this year. I've been reading a lot of indie fantasy this year. Cold Silver for Souls, if it's not the best self-published fantasy novel I've ever read, it's like top 3. It is one of the best. So if you've had questions about maybe reading one of Tori's books, if you've been wondering about that, definitely pick this one up. Like I said, I would recommend this even over The Bloodstones. This is an excellent novel. Even if you're somebody who doesn't like Westerns, number one, like give them a try. And this isn't a bad place to start. It does some blending of the genre, so that'll help appeal to you. There's a lot of fantasy stuff in here, but it is first and foremost a Western novel. I really liked it. I pretty highly recommend this book. Let me see here. Where are we going to put Cold Silver for Souls here? I think we are going to drop it right above Stress of Her Regard and just below Nightside the Long Sun. Very, very much enjoyed this book. Thanks, Tori, for sending me the arc. This has definitely been one of my highlights of my reading this year, has been getting to go through this book. All right. Next, we're going to talk about another self-published fantasy novel, and that is going to be The Severing Sun by Von Roycroft. Once again, thank you to Von Roycroft for sending me an audio arc of this novel. Very much appreciate you sending that out to me. So, The Severing Sun is a historically inspired fantasy novel about the son of an exiled chieftain who is unwillingly drugged back into the heart of his old tribe's conflicts. And basically, has the crux of the story is him coming to a point and having to make the decision between fighting for his family or for the very tribe, the very people who exiled him and his family to begin with. Like I said, this novel feels like it is something right out of the pages of history. Vaughn does a very good job, kind of like what we've talked about with R. Scott Baker and J.L. Odom before, of crafting characters who feel very much of their time. They don't feel like they're people you would meet in 2025. They feel very much like they are of the time and place in which the story occurs. This book reminded me in a lot of ways of two things. One, sort of and there's a similar DNA here, even though they'll seem very different. One is the Northmen portions of the First Law trilogy. Some of that scrappy, rough dialogue between characters, some of that banter is something, and the camping and the army elements of it is something that Von Roycroft really captures in this book. This is very much a military fantasy novel. And also the Dothraki portions of A Song of Ice and Fire. Some of that comes out here. Now, my understanding is that Vaughn was heavily inspired by the Rohirrim from the Lord of the Rings, and that is fortunate because Rohan is my favorite of the nations in the Lord of the Rings book. So that's definitely something that appeals to me there as well. There's also a lot of interesting questions that Vaughn asks in this book. Questions about the courses in life that are set for us. How much do we have control over our destiny? How much can we change what's been fated for us or not? And also questions about at what cost do you defend your own honor? At what point does it become a personal mission, a personal vendetta that's ultimately doing more harm than good? I compared this to A Song of Ice and Fire a minute ago, and it's certainly not as vast or complicated or as refined as George Martin is. I'm not going to say that. So this isn't going to be the Game of Thrones meets blank comparison. But honestly, I did find some of Vaughn's writing to be reminiscent of George Martin's in a lot of the actual writing that he did. But then sometimes how some of the characters came across as well reminded me of Martin. Yeah, so overall, I enjoyed this book. I would say if I had to give a couple of statements that are maybe a little bit more negative, is that I had a harder time connecting with a lot of side characters in this book. There are a few key main characters who are interesting, pulled me through the story, found very engaging, but this has quite a big cast of side characters. It's not particularly large for any epic fantasy book, but for the story that it was telling, it's not a small cast of characters. And because I had a hard time getting invested in them, for me it was tricky to tell some of them apart. So that is something that didn't work as well for me, but I haven't heard other people talk about this, so my suspicion is that that's more of a me thing than an issue with the book. This is a very well written book on a craft level. There's really nothing that I can knock off points for Vaughn as far as that goes. And Zachary Shea, who I mentioned earlier in the video, he's been reading book 2 and has been telling me that it is dramatically better than this one, or more entertaining at least. He said that he's liked it quite a bit, and I think he probably liked Severing Sun even more than I did. So his hyping up of book 2 has definitely got me excited for it. I think it takes a bit of a darker turn than where you would expect this to go in this book. I think that the main character is maybe not what you would expect from a typical hero's journey. So, and I also know there's a big time jump in between book 1 and book 2, which is definitely another thing that piques my interest here. So, as far as where we're gonna put Severing Sun, let's grab this here. I think we are gonna drop this just below Alternate Routes and above The Liberation by Ian Trigillus. So, yeah, really liked it a lot. It's going to be solidly in that good tier there. And we are going to talk about the last book that I read during this segment, which is going to be True Grit by Charles Portis. So I've meant to reread True Grit for a while. but haven't gotten around to it. I think I read it for the first time. It was either last year or 2 years ago, but it was pretty recently. Um, but I loved it. I love this book through and through. And then Britain from some Okie dude said, "Hey, we should read it again." Once again, it's in June. June on the Range. You read westerns in June. So I'm glad that I got a chance to go back to True Grit. Once again, this is a first person point of view story. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, have seen one of the two movies of it. It is about a young girl named Maddie who decides to go out and seek justice for her father, who was murdered by basically a farmhand, who's then gone on the run. And the local law is pretty indifferent to her plight. So she goes out and she seeks the meanest, nastiest lawman that she can find, which is a man named Rooster Cogburn, and she calls him a man of true grit, and hires him to go and hunt down Tom Chaney, the man who killed her father. And she goes with him. And so, what sounds like a very basic wolf and cub story, I think has a lot more depth to it. Once again, I haven't had my conversation with Britain, so I hesitate putting out all of my thoughts on the table here. But just like we talked about with Tori Tekken's book earlier, this is told from the first person and has a very, very strong character voice. Maddie just comes across very strongly from the page. She's telling it as an older woman and sort of like reminiscing on her adventure and what happened. And I say adventure loosely because this book is kind of a dark one in a lot of ways. You get some humor from Maddie being so scrappy and sassy, and talking to adults who are twice her age and size. But there's something dark about a young girl having to step in and do what the adults in her life are unwilling to do. And I picked this. I should say I picked this cover for it because I think it's just does not fit the book at all and does not look appealing in any way. So picked the worst possible cover I could find here. But I think Charles Portis, number one, captures the spirit and attitude and character of a girl better than almost any other author that I've read. I think he does a magnificent job writing like a young teenage girl for being obviously not that when he wrote it. But I think his basic writing is very beautiful, but also he writes a story that has no fat on it. It's very compelling. It keeps moving. There's a lot of time to be introspective and give thought to what's going on, but there's never a wasted page, probably not even a wasted sentence in this book. If you haven't read True Grit, do yourself a favor, pick it up. It is well worth the read. I'm going to save my further thoughts on that for my conversation with Britain. Don't want to give it all away, other than to say, we're definitely dropping this in the reread tier. Doesn't go anywhere else on the official tier list here, obviously. But I really enjoyed this one a lot. I'm glad I got to reread it. Thanks, Britain, for pushing me to reread this one again. And seriously, I can't emphasize that enough, guys. Like, if you have not read True Grit, if you're not sure where you want to go with westerns, after you read Cold Silver for Souls, read True Grit. I don't know if True Grit is one of my favorite novels of all time, but if it's not, it's close. It might not be in the top 10, but it's probably in the top 20 or 30. I really like that one quite a bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my reading plans coming up. I'm not totally sure what all of them will be, but I know for sure what at least one thing will be, and that is I'm going to try reading more short stories. So I have here a bind up of a bunch of the Conan stories by Robert E. Howard. This is obviously like a fantasy staple. Like, you've got to read Conan the Cimmerian. I've read a few of these, but I want to read this whole bind up. I have another bind up and the Solomon Kane stories. So got a lot of Robert E. Howard that I could hit. And then also some of George Martin's short fiction. I've heard people say that his short fiction is better than even his long works, which like blows my mind. So I want to read his short fiction. Once again, heard a lot of good things. And then also I recently got this bind up of all the short stories by Tim Powers. So with my Tim Powers kick, might as well get through the his short stories as well. And I'm reading these not just because I want to read more short stories in general. I say these, not that one specifically, but just all the short stories. I'm not just doing it because I want to read more short stories, although I do. I think I've got a bit of something in the works with them too. So stay tuned for maybe a little bit of content on short stories. So anyway, guys, thank goodness this one has been shorter than normal. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed just being with me and going over what I read recently. So yeah, let me know if you have thoughts on any of this, what you've been reading recently and enjoying. And can't wait to see you next time, guys. Thanks for watching.